All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Williams, and I'm a librarian at the Fayetteville Public Library. And I want to thank you all for watching this evening and joining us. Tonight, we're speaking with David Hill, author of The Vapors. And The Vapors was recently chosen by the New York Times Book Review as a summer reading pick. And it follows the rise and fall of Hot Springs, Arkansas from the 1930s to the 1960s. And David will be taking questions from you all. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to comment on the video and we'll try to ask as many as we can. Thank you for being here, David. I'm really excited about this book because I'm also from Hot Springs. And I heard a lot about this growing up. But for those people who didn't have the pleasure of growing up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, could you tell us a little bit about your book? What is The Vapors?
Sure. And thanks for inviting me, Corey. This is really cool, and I'm excited to get to do it. The Vapors is it's a kind of a blended work of historical nonfiction and family memoir, and it follows three characters through the period of time from about 1931 till about 1968. And those three characters are Oni Madden, who is a fairly well-known New York Prohibition-era crime boss who, after he gets out of prison for murder, comes to Hot Springs and becomes kind of like, you know, the mob's man in Arkansas. Dane Harris, who was a young man who grew up in the Hot Springs area and kind of rose the ranks and eventually became what we call the boss gambler, the kind of boss of the town's casino interests. And Hazel Hill, who was my paternal grandmother, who shows up in Hot Springs around the same time Oni Madden does in the early 30s as a teenager with her father, who was a horse trainer who was following the horse racing circuit, and gets kind of left in Hot Springs to kind of fend for herself and ends up starting and raising a family there. And so it tells the story of these three people's lives during that period of time, for a while kind of in parallel, but by the end, their stories all kind of intersect more or less at this club called the Vapors, which was a casino in Hot Springs that Dane Harris opened in 1960 that was kind of the crown jewel of the city's gambling business, which I should also say for folks who are watching this who maybe don't know, was an illegal gambling business, right? Gambling was illegal in Arkansas during this entire period of time, which is what makes the story kind of remarkable, is that Hot Springs was functioning kind of as Las Vegas before America had Las Vegas as we know it today, even though it was in complete violation of state and federal law.
That's great. That's a very well-rounded story of Hot Springs, because you've got the horse racing and the gambling and then, you know, everything in between. So what kind of made you want to write about this story? What made you want to write about the Vapors and also to write about, I guess, your grandparents?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in Hot Springs, and so like you, I kind of grew up around a lot of the lore of Hot Springs' history as well. And so it was always something that I was, you know, fascinated by. I don't know that I really had a burning desire to write a book about it until I wrote a piece. I guess the first inkling that there might be something there, some depths that I could plumb as a writer, was that I wrote a piece for ESPN in, I think, 2011 or 2012 that was about Oaklawn. And that piece was more than just this piece about Oaklawn. In that piece, I also got into the city's history and also my family history. And it was about Hazel, and it was about some trouble that her husband got into, and it was about Leo McLaughlin and the mayor of Hot Springs that brought gambling in, and sort of some of the kind of seedier history of Hot Springs. Anyway, when this piece came out, I got a lot of reaction to it, more than maybe anything I'd ever written before. And, you know, most of that reaction was, what is this place? I can't believe I've never heard of it before. You know, a lot of folks who really thought they knew everything there was to know about the, you know, history of the gambling business or organized crime or whatever, were just astounded to find out that something this magnitude went on in a place like Arkansas and that they had never heard of it. And so that was my first that was the first that I realized that that the story that I grew up around and took for granted, you know, as being like a story everybody knew, that nobody really outside of a small radius knew about it anymore. And so maybe there was an opportunity to retell it, or maybe tell it for the first time. I'm not really sure the right, what exactly the Vapors does, but so I had that in the back of my mind for a while. And then fast forward years later, when editors were kind of asking me to write a book, and I'd pitch book ideas. Every time I'd pitch this idea, people's like eyes would light up, and they'd say, "Wow, that I would buy that book today." So I think that's why in the end I decided I would take a stab at it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And growing up, or at least growing up in Arkansas, you always hear about this. And I guess you just assume, like you said, that everybody's heard about it. I don't know, have you had a lot of interest from people in other states, asking you to talk and speak on hot springs?
Yeah, I mean, the book is doing really well outside of Arkansas, believe it or not. I think when it was published, I was really depending on Arkansas to carry this book forward, because I knew there'd be some interest in it back there. But what surprised me is how much interest there's been outside of Arkansas. It's really been well received, and I think that almost, and universally I've heard from so many people. I mean, look, there's two types of people that react to the book. There's either the people that say, "Oh my God, I've never even heard of this story. This is incredible. How could this important piece of history be so whatever, like obscured and had disappeared the way it has." And the other kind of reaction is "Oh, I'd heard about that," right? Or like, "I had a grandparent who used to visit there," or "I'd heard about this when I was a kid." Like people who did have some inkling of it and were kind of excited to finally get a chance to read something kind of more in depth about it. So I think those are the kind of the two big reactions that I usually get so far from the book.
Yeah, and then going back to the Vapors Club, I know that it brought in a lot of money, kind of an enormous amount. Did you ever figure out like how much? I know there's probably not exact figures, but how profitable it was. I think some people don't understand how big of an organization it really was.
Well, the Vapors was one. I mean, at the time the Vapors was open, it was one of anywhere from I mean, depending on how you want to define it, right? I mean, there was some form of gambling in several dozen establishments throughout Hot Springs. I mean, restaurants and barbershops and lots of places had things like a slot machine or whatever, or maybe some other type of game. But there were really 8 major casinos and a handful of sort of minor casinos throughout Hot Springs during that period of time. The Vapors was definitely the kind of crown jewel, and in a way you could pair the Vapors with the Belvedere Club, which was kind of a seasonal operation on the outskirts of town that was that would operate mainly during the race season, the horse racing season. But yeah, I mean, gambling in Hot Springs at its peak was pulling in as much in profits as the state of Nevada was. And I give a caveat in the book that like we really don't know how much profit was generated in Nevada, because what we know now is that organized crime figures were skimming a lot of money off the top, right? But we also don't know how much money was being skimmed off the top in Arkansas either. I mean, there was certainly no, legal requirement for them to report all their income. Of course, a lot of them did try to cross all their T's and dot all their I's, because they wanted to keep this kind of delicate balance, this dance that kept gambling going in Hot Springs. But yeah, certainly hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And the Vapors specifically, I did get my hands on some financial records from one particular year when I was able to go through some of Dane Harris's personal papers, and he did record like the profit and loss of all the different slot machines and craps tables and blackjack tables. But they also made a lot of money because the Vapors wasn't just a casino; it was a nightclub that had sort of world-class entertainment. It had a lounge and a theater and a restaurant and a coffee shop. And so the Vapors function on a lot of different levels other than just gambling. And yeah, like you said, it brought in a lot of money, and it made Dane Harris wealthy, but it also made a lot of other people in Hot Springs wealthy as well.
Right, yeah. And then I know reading your book, I like kind of knew this, but that like Liberace was under contract there, and all of these really big names would perform there. It was it was one of the stops, I guess, along a tour,
Yeah, it was a place that I mean, really there weren't a lot of places that had this kind of entertainment in 1960. I mean, even Las Vegas had really only recently toyed with the idea of like having showrooms and theatrical kind of entertainment to go along with gambling. So this was kind of a more of a East Coast kind of New York City type thing than it was a Las Vegas thing at that moment. That's not to say that there weren't casinos in Las Vegas that were toying with this idea of having big shows or whatever, bring in these kinds of acts. But it certainly wasn't as big of a deal in 1960 as it became later with the advent of the large strip casinos in Vegas. And Dane Harris, I think, borrowed this. I don't know if he kind of came up with this idea because he wanted hot springs to have more than what they call sawdust joints, right? I mean, a sawdust joint is like, just a straight up no frills gambling hall, right? Where they call it that because there'd be sawdust on the floor, in case people wanted to spit tobacco or whatever on the floor. And, he thought hot springs deserved like, this kind of upper crust type establishment. And that's what his vision for the Vapors was to create more than just a casino, but like a real supper club type thing. And he spent a fortune on bringing in entertainment, and a lot of people thought he was nuts that he wouldn't make any profits because he was spending so much money to bring in whatever, right? Like Mickey Rooney or the Andrews Sisters or Les Paul, or like he brought in every big name he could bring in. And the Vapors also was a place that entertainers knew about because they could kind of workshop material there too, right? Like there were a couple of different Broadway shows that they brought the show to the Vapors to try it out in front of the audience there to warm it up before they took it back to New York or to Las Vegas. So that showed that people kind of had a respect for the clientele and the crowd in Hot Springs too, that they thought that was a classy enough place that they could come try out, some of their stuff before they went to New York City. So, Hot Springs was definitely on the map, and, among entertainers, whether those were, singers or bands or comedians or whatever. I mean, performers who traveled the circuit in the United States, black, white, all different types of music, they all knew about Hot Springs. Hot Springs was always a stop. It was a place that everybody made it to.
Yeah, so neat. And one thing I was going to ask you was, I grew up in Hot Springs, and I've heard what I call the legends. Everybody has a story. I was wondering, was it difficult for you when talking to people to decide what was fact and what was kind of some fiction or some exaggeration told throughout time?
Yeah, no, it was really difficult. And I think even to this day, I wonder, one of the things that writing this book, I think, really taught me was, how difficult it is to get to what's fact and what's not fiction, because so many of the sources that we rely on to know what's true are all also in and of themselves kind of unreliable, or can be unreliable, right? And so I think in the beginning, I approached this project that I was going to utilize, things like court records, police records, newspaper accounts, whatever, as like, that would be, that if I found something in one of those kinds of documents, then that would be kind of truth or whatever. And FBI records, I used a lot of FBI records. And that when people were retelling stories, that's less reliable because people's memories are kind of, people don't always remember things exactly like they happened, or stories get told through the grapevine in different ways. But what I found was that even those documents that we often rely on as being kind of undeniably true are riddled with misinformation, right? I mean, a lot of the FBI files that I went through, these FBI agents would get their information from informants who sometimes had reasons to lie to them, and the FBI agent had to decide who's lying to them and who's not, right? Or a police record is the same thing, or a court transcript, or or a deposition or something. I mean, even a newspaper report of something. I mean, the people that journalist is talking to, that journalist had to make decisions about who's telling them the truth and who's not. So we're all just investing a lot of faith into these kind of different storytellers throughout history, that they're telling us a story that they deem to be true, whether that person was a journalist, a police officer, a court, an FBI agent, another writer, or a family member, or whatever. And I'm just another person in that line, trying to tell a story, and that hopefully readers will trust that I endeavored to do my best to tell the truest story that I could. But yeah, a lot of people would tell me stories that I would doubt, or they'd tell me a story that I had heard from someone else completely differently. And often I'd be left with these kind of differing accounts, and I would just have to figure out which one did I think was more true. And in the end, the book that you read is my sense of what's true based on kind of my 5 years of submerging myself in this and doing all this research. And I'm just asking the reader to trust that, like, I'm not saying this is all true. I'm saying this is my best sense of what's all true based on everything that I learned over those 5 years. And I certainly document everything that I wrote pretty thoroughly in the back in the notes section, so people can all go and check my sources if they want and come to their own conclusion if they think that something that I wrote might differ with something that their papa told them.
Yeah, it is. You do a great job of keeping notes. I was impressed by that. I do have a few questions are starting to roll in. If you want to start answering a couple from people watching. Let's see. Well, here's one right here. Malin asks, was the fact Hot Springs was neutral among gangsters what made it so popular?
That's a good question, and that's definitely one of the kind of myths that has propagated about Hot Springs my whole life, is that this idea that Hot Springs was so there's a story that I think people have always told in Hot Springs, that the reason so many gangsters visited there and spent time there, and I think that's something that you'll see in the book, or maybe that if anybody else has ever read about Hot Springs that they'll see, is that every kind of big name crime figure in America has spent some considerable amount of time in Hot Springs. And so the explanation for that has always been, well, Hot Springs was a place that gangsters around the country thought of as neutral territory. And when they were in Hot Springs, they could feel safe. They weren't going to have any fighting there. They didn't have to look over their shoulder. I don't think that that's totally true. I mean, certainly, there was Al Capone was almost assassinated in Hot Springs by a rival gangster. And there were plenty of other stories that I read, and some made it in the book, some ended up not making the book, of other kind of gang wars that spilled into Hot Springs and bloodshed that happened in Hot Springs because of violence that was happening in other towns. I think that what's probably more accurate is that this idea that there were a bunch of warring mobs around the country, that there were all these little tiny gangs that all fought each other, is actually not really the way that the mob worked, especially getting into that period of time, into the middle of into the late 1950s and early 1960s. What's more true is that the mob was very well organized around the country, and that there'd be these kind of tensions or these fights that would happen, these like inter-scene fights between some leaders or leadership battles within one organization. But for the most part, these are all folks that did business with each other. And by business, that means they either sold illegal liquor, and then after liquor was legal again, they ran gambling and sometimes prostitution and sometimes drugs. And that was kind of the mob's business around the country. So, so I don't think that Hot Springs was like neutral territory. I don't think there's a lot of, there's plenty of evidence that it wasn't, and that people were more than willing to carry whatever beefs they had into Hot Springs. The truth is, gangsters like to visit Hot Springs and vacation Hot Springs because A, Hot Springs had gambling and prostitution and it was permitted, but B, Hot Springs was a wholly corrupt town. I mean, every single level of government in Hot Springs was completely corrupted, from the mayor down to the dog catcher. And if you read my book, one of the stories that I tell kind of in detail in the book is the story of Charles Lucky Luciano, who was one of the top gangsters in America, who, when the authorities in New York had a warrant out for him, he came to Hot Springs to hide out. And in Hot Springs, he was protected by the police department and the sheriff's department and the mayor and the judges. And they protected him to such an extent that they were willing to go to war with the feds and the New York authorities and the state authorities in Arkansas to protect him. So that's part of why gangsters like to hang out in Hot Springs. It wasn't because they felt safe from other gangsters. They felt safe from the cops, because the cops in Hot Springs were theirs, So I think that's a big reason why it was so popular among crime figures.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. There was another question from Dale, and he said, enjoyed your book immensely, and curious about how Hot Springs old-timers have responded to the book.
I mean, obviously, I would say Hot Springs old-timers are not a monolithic group, right? So I can't actually speak for all Hot Springs old-timers, but among the ones that I've talked to, I think people have enjoyed it. And I've heard a lot of really complimentary things from folks who were alive back then, or maybe who are the children of people who were alive and important figures in this book, who have told me that they thought that, I did as good of a job as anybody could. And I take that as a great compliment, because I think there's some recognition there that, there's a limit to how much people can really tell the true accounting of the story, given that so many people passed away and took their stories to the grave with them. But so far I've heard a lot of a lot of good things from the whatever quote unquote old timers from Hot Springs, and I'm sure there are people out there that don't like it, and fortunately those emails have all gone to spam or but I'm sure they're out there and they'll find their way to me sometime eventually.
Yeah. Well, and one of the people watching, Paul, said I was living there in the 40s through the 60s, and you got most of it right. So
Thanks, Paul.
yeah.
I'll take that. I'll take most of it.
Renee asked, what kind of gambling went on at the Vapors? Like what type?
Well, I mean, every type, I guess you could say. I mean, there were, craps was a big game at the Vapors. They had craps, they had blackjack, they had, and they had slot machines. Um, and I think the big money maker for the Vapors was dice, was craps games. But I think that was really a function of the time. I think that in the early 1960s, I think it was a very fashionable game, and that casinos and kind of gambling operations around the country were making a lot of money from dice games. But this was also the beginning of the age of the slot machine, and the Vapors and Dane Harris and the guys that ran the Vapors were really they were kind of trailblazers in that. They created their own slot machines at the Vapors, and they had their own design, and the slot machine business, by the time the Vapors came around, became a crucial business to all the gambling businesses in Hot Springs. And so, Dane andOni's ownership of the slot machines became a big, powerful kind of cudgel for them in the gambling industry in Hot Springs. And it's because I think they realized the potential to make money there, that more and more people were using slot machines. The technology was changing. You don't have to pay a slot machine. You don't have to pay somebody to sit there and deal cards. And so if gambling had continued on in Hot Springs, it would have gone the same way that it has in every other place in America, towards this kind of, towards machine gambling. So in some ways, the Vapors was really ahead of its time, because I think they were one of the first, they were really at the cutting edge of slot machines in Hot Springs as well.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely makes sense. You don't have to pay them, and then they just sit there and keep going.
Yeah.
They can be played all night if they need to. And then, there's so many questions, David.
Oh, boy.
Sarah says that she loved the book, and she was curious to know more about your research process and how long it took you to write the book. Were most people willing to be interviewed and talk about their personal experiences? Which was a question I actually wanted to ask too. Would people talk to you?
Well, I think so. I lived in Hot Springs for a year while I was researching and writing this book. My family moved down there from New York, and we lived there for a year. And that really helped a lot. I think that prior to that, I really tricked myself into thinking I could write this book from New York and just fly to Arkansas a few times a year or whatever, and kind of drop in and out and do interviews on the phone or whatnot. And that was really foolish. If I had kept that up, I'd probably still be writing the book. It really helped to be there, because I think I had to, chase down leads and, really, but also it inspired me to be there too. I mean, being there and kind of walking in the footsteps, that these same people I was writing about were walking in. And I lived down the street from the Vapors, and every day I would walk down Park Avenue. I'd walk right by the Vapors on my way to the coffee shop to write. So that was really kind of inspiring too. And I'm glad that I did it. I think that helped the book a lot too. Research was it took me 5 years, all told, to write the book, and I didn't think it would take me that long. Honestly, I spent a lot of time waiting on files from the FBI, which in the end became really important to the book. I mean, a lot of the records I got from the FBI, either directly from the FBI or from other researchers that had files that they shared with me, those files were invaluable, because sometimes they had transcripts that provided me dialogue that would help me kind of move a scene along or show how people talked. It really helped me make the book more literary, to have that kind of stuff, so that it wasn't just a straight sort of telling of history, but that I, with the help of having kind of with the help of the FBI violating these people's civil rights, I was able to write a much better book because they had these secret recordings of people's conversations. But also those files really helped me, kind of, I don't know, I had like a board in my office that was kind of like one of those crazy conspiracy theory boards with like all the different strings, because I actually had to make, do a lot of that kind of research to make all these connections. And I think FBI files really helped me a lot with that. Yeah, I did a lot of research in the Arkansas Democrat and Gazette and Sentinel Record and Hot Springs New Era Records, at the Garland County Historical Society. And they had a lot of back issues of the Arkansas Citizen, which was the African-American newspaper. And they had, they had a lot of documents that really helped me a lot too. But I also interviewed a lot of people. And to answer your second question, yeah, there were some people that flat out refused to talk to me. I mean, there's some interviews that I desperately wanted that I just couldn't get because they refused to talk for different reasons, and I could speculate about what some people's reasons were, but I mean, I had some people tell me straight up, like, well, I'm going to write my own book. And I said, okay, great. I can't wait to read it. And I meant it too. There are some people out there that I know could write an amazing book because they had such great stories, but they weren't willing to share them with me. There were other people who I think were really scared to talk to me because they felt like there might be some retribution, not from like powerful, whatever, scary gangsters or whatever, but just from other people in the community. I mean, people need to remember Hot Springs is still a small town. A lot of families that are in this book still live around there and people still know each other. And I think some people just had this concern that if they told a story, they'd have to, face somebody at Thanksgiving or maybe at the grocery store or something. I think that might have scared some folks off too. And then, some people just didn't want to talk to me because whatever, they didn't know me and they didn't know what I was up to. So they decided not to chat with me. So, there were some stories that I feel like I never got because the people didn't talk to me, but there were a lot of stories that I did get that were great. And there were, I feel like I spend too much time focused on the folks that said no and not enough time kind of celebrating and applauding all the people who said yes, because without all those people that did let me into their homes, shared their time with me, share their photographs with me, their personal, their family stories with me. Without all of that, this book wouldn't have happened. And so, I'm eternally grateful to all the people that over those 5 years did, allow me to sit down and talk to them about sometimes very painful, and emotional memories.
Great. Let's see. Oh, well, Patty asked a very similar question. She loved the book, fascinating. Would love to know if you have reactions from some of the people close to families and businesses.
Again, most of the reactions I've heard have been very positive. I feel like when people ask these questions, they're wondering if whether or not people are pissed off, like whether or not I've made people mad with this book. And I think that speaks to how much people back there do still feel like it's almost like scandalous that somebody would write about this stuff. There's this woman so one of the women I write about in this book is Maxine Jones, who was this famous madam from Hot Springs. She ran a couple of brothels in Hot Springs and was a very colorful character. And she shows up in my book a couple of times, and she's notorious, but she wrote a book in the 1980s, and it was her tell-all memoir of her life. And she changed everybody's name, right? Every name in the book is a pseudonym. And she put out that book, and that was a minor scandal. I mean, it was like, people went totally, and this was in the 80s, so nobody was, almost everybody was still alive, right? So when her book came out, it was a bit of a sensation. And people, would create their own little list of who was who, like what are the different pseudonyms, like who was this person, who was that person. And I don't think anybody really ever took, after that, I think that might have cooled off the appetite for this sort of people telling the tales after Maxine's book came out. So I think there's a little bit of residual, effect of that, where people think like, I can't believe that some of these stories would be told. But honestly, I don't think that there's anything in this book that's that scandalous, really. I mean, and everything that's in the book is not, it's not hearsay. I mean, some of the stuff, I did find some things in the book that I think nobody had really ever realized before, or knew before, that took some research and some digging and connecting dots to find. And maybe people think some of that's scandalous, but yeah, I mean, a lot of the people in this book have passed on. This business is, there's no more illegal gambling business in Hot Springs. The statute of limitations, I'm pretty sure, has run out on a lot of this stuff. So honestly, I hope that what my book can do is really thaw that ground that was sort of frozen over there, and encourage more people to tell their stories. Because one of the things I heard over and over again from people that I interviewed was, I really wish I asked my dad more questions when he was alive. Or I really wish I asked my mom more questions when she was alive. I don't know the answer to your questions because I never asked my parents, and I wish that I had. And so that was a lesson I took to heart writing this book, was that, we all should be telling these stories. Sometimes there's stories that we don't want to tell because we think they're unflattering, or we think people will judge us or whatever. But like, this kind of oral history needs to be passed on. And I hope, and if people have for whatever reason people have to like keep some of these stories in themselves, I wish they would, write them down and maybe, I don't know, stick in an envelope for someone to find after they're gone, because, someone's got to tell these stories or they'll be lost to time. They'll be lost forever.
Like
and
a
this
little time capsule in your backyard.
I'm sorry?
just a little time capsule in their backyard with all of their secrets.
Yeah,
That
do
would be
something, or else or it dies, or it goes to the grave with us. And this story in this book, I think, was in real danger. I mean, there were a number of people in this book that I reached out to talk to and found out they had just recently passed away, and that kept happening to me. And that's when I realized, like, wow, we got to get this book done now, because whatever, we're like 50 years on now. And there's so much of this that I think was in real danger of sort of slipping away and being lost to time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, my mother, one of her friends, Madam Maxine's book, which was it Call Me? It was Call Me Madam. What's the name?
Call Me
of it?
Madam. Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of my mother's friends had a copy of it, but all the names, she had figured out who all the people were, and that was such a scandal. And
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think after Maxine's book, people kind of got scared and stopped talking about it as much because there was that fear.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have one other question. Kim asks, what finally shut Hot Springs down? She says, I'd love to hear you discuss Hot Springs in the late 60s and 70s.
It's a great question. And originally this book was going to go all the way into the early 70s. I had originally pitched the book, the story of the book would go all the way to Rockefeller getting elected governor, and the story of Lynn Davis, which I'll get into in a second. But like the story doesn't end when this book ends. In fact, the next chapter of the story might even be more exciting in some ways. But as I was writing and I got to the scene where Oni Madden dies and his funeral, it just felt like an ending, you know what I mean? And so I decided in the book where I ended it, not for historical reasons, but for literary ones, right? I felt like at the end of the day, like, if I was going to write just a purely historical account of Hot Springs, I'd write like a 700-page tome that only people from Hot Springs would ever want to read. So I made a really tough decision to kind of wrap the book up shortly after Oni's funeral, because it felt sort of, it felt like that was an ending to me. And I just didn't want to ignore that instinct. And there is an epilogue in the book that I think gets into some of what happens later. The gambling, continues on into rock. So people understand that maybe don't know all this history. The governor of Arkansas was a man named Oral Faubus. And when he finally decides not to run for election anymore, a guy named Winthrop Rockefeller runs and becomes the first Republican elected governor of Arkansas since Reconstruction. And, he is a Rockefeller, right? He is the brother of the governor of New York and the sort of kind of the famous Rockefeller fortune. And so he's a seriously rich dude who ends up having a place to live in Arkansas, because Arkansas is one of the 2 states in America where you can actually get a quick no-fault divorce. And he wants to get divorced from his wife, so he moves to Arkansas to get this divorce. But in getting this house in Arkansas, he also kind of gets ensconced into politics, Arkansas politics. And long story short, he ends up becoming governor. And after he gets elected governor, he appoints a new head of the Arkansas State Police and charges this guy to go and shut gambling down in Hot Springs. This is something that no governor before him had ever successfully really done. Every governor before him had kind of taken the attitude of, it's a local issue, they'll handle it locally. If the local police want the Arkansas State Police help, I'll help. Otherwise, I'm not going to get involved in it. And so Rockefeller and this guy, Lynn Davis, decide they're going to go down there and shut it down. At that point, gambling in Hot Springs it had really slowed down quite a bit. After 1965, the only thing that was really left were some smaller clubs, and there was really it wasn't the same as it was in the first part of the decade, but there was still gambling going on. And Davis kind of gets into this cat and mouse game with all the gamblers, where they, he would go to shut down a club, they'd hear that he was coming, they'd be able to hide all the slot machines and the gambling equipment before he got there. And he keeps getting frustrated that people keep tipping off the gamblers that he's coming. And this goes on and on until he finally is able to get tipped off on where they're stashing all the slot machines. He raids it, he takes them all, he burns them, he destroys them, burns them, buries them 30 feet underground, like bulldozes them. And that's pretty much the end. But during that same period of time, there are there's assassination attempts made on Rockefeller's life, and Rockefeller goes to the press and says, I'm pretty sure this is gamblers in Hot Springs that are trying to have me killed. So the story gets pretty wild when you get into the late 60s and the early 70s. I should also say that guy, Lynn Davis, the head of the state police, he goes to jail because a judge demands that he tell them who his informants were, and he won't tell them, so they put him in jail for contempt of court. He's the only guy that ever went to jail for gambling in Hot Springs, was the cop who tried to shut it down. So that sort of corruption continued apace all the way into the late 1960s and early 1970s. So I wish that I could have told the story all the way to the end. But yeah, gambling doesn't really officially get kind of the last rites read over it until Rockefeller becomes governor and Lynn Davis comes in and finally, puts it to rest.
Yeah, and there's lots of pictures of them bulldozing getting rid of all of the slot machines and burying them underground and all of that stuff. Sarah asked, what was your relationship with your grandmother growing up? And what was the rest of Hazel's life like? And what about Dane? So she'd like to know more about your family.
Well, I had a great relationship with my grandmother growing up. She at the end of the Vapors, and I guess this is a spoiler, people haven't read it or whatever, but at the end of the Vapors, she ends up with this carnival man, and she goes on the road with him to travel around the carnival to basically, scam people out of their money around the country at the carnival. And so this is the guy she ends up with by the time I'm born and I'm a little kid, she and this man, they're like my grandparents. And so I grew up knowing them, and they were very colorful people. They had a lot of great stories, and he was a tout out at the racetrack, and he was. I really liked them. I thought of them as being like, she was a doting grandmother. I always thought of her as being, a real pushover in some ways as a little kid, and I loved listening to them tell stories. She lives until the early 1990s, and Hazel, I think, kicks a lot of her big, substance abuse problems by that time, and lives the rest of her life in relative peace and quiet and poverty, but she lives a long life, and I think that that's kind of a miracle in and of itself that she made it that far, because as you see in the book, she had a lot of close calls where maybe she shouldn't have made it. And so but I had a great relationship with Hazel growing up, and so did my father, weirdly enough. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about my dad and his relationship with his mom is, you can see in the book that, like, he really ends up being a caretaker for her, and I think he had a strange relationship to her, different relationship to her than his older brothers did, because to him, he felt he had to take care of her for so long that even into adulthood, he felt a real fondness for her and did not blame her for a lot of the things that she did, some of the bad mistakes that she may have made, or, bad choices she made as a mother growing up. So he's very close to her too, the rest of her life. And Dane, I mean, Dane Harris was, Dane Harris has the most interesting story of all, because after he shuts down the Vapors, he ends up going to Turkey. He goes into business with a guy that runs Holiday Inn, and they open up a casino in Istanbul, Turkey, Casino de Istanbul, and he starts flying these junkets of all of his old customers from the Vapors, because he has this black book filled with high roller gamblers, and he starts chartering flights for them to fly to Istanbul to gamble at their casino in Turkey. And they do that for a few years until there's a new government in Turkey, a religious government that takes over and decides gambling is bad and shuts it down. So poor Dane Harris twice fell victim to, pious religious leaders who thought gambling was a sin, and he and lost his business once again. But he kept the Vapors going in Hot Springs as a supper club, and then his son eventually takes over, and they ran it as, I think I talked about this in the book, but they tried to run the Vapors, whatever the sort of new thing was with the times, like it was a disco, it was a honky tonk or whatever, and so the Vapor stays open until the early 90s as well. But Dane died in the 1980s from cancer, but he was always trying to stay in action, and he definitely tried to keep the fires burning after he closed the Vapors, for sure.
Yeah, and I think someone recently tried to reopen it again, correct?
Right. Yeah. Right. What I've heard is that right before the coronavirus, somebody had bought it and reopened it to try to, run it as a venue again, as a nightclub. Mm-hmm. So bad timing there, but hopefully, eventually they'll be able to see it happen. So we may actually start seeing, musical acts and performances at the Vapors once again. But prior to that, it had been a church for many years.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and Melanie asked, what is your background and where did you go to college?
what's my background? I mean, I went to college at the University of Texas at Austin, much to my father's chagrin. And I spent, after college, I spent about 15 years as a union organizer. And so I traveled around the country, whatever, just stirring up trouble and organizing. Although I tend to, I think that that time I spent, you know, a big part of the job of an organizer is really to sit with people in their homes and listen to them while they tell you their life story, you know? And so I feel like I spent more than a decade traveling around the country, sitting down with strangers and really just listening to them tell me their stories. And I feel like at some point that probably taught me how to tell a story. So, you know, once I became a writer, I think that that gave me a good well to draw from in terms of, you know, thinking about storytelling. But yeah, I spent about 15 years doing that. And then I started writing around 2011 I used to write a column for McSweeney's called Fading the Vig, A Gambler's Guide to Life. And it was a weekly column about gambling. And after I started writing that column, I got an agent. I got asked to write other places. And over time, eventually I just started to make more and more money from kind of freelance writing gigs that I was getting, that I eventually decided that I would just try to do it full time. And I got, you know, more and more into it. And so I've been writing since, you know, around 2011. I've been writing pretty much full time, and this is my first book, but I hope it's not my last.
That's great. One thing I did want to ask you, I kind of wanted your opinion, because I feel like Americans do have this fascination with gangsters and the mob. I mean, there's a whole genre of movies, you know, gangster mobster movies, and you know, and they're not good guys. You know, they're bad guys. And I just wondered what you thought. Why do you think, especially Americans, I believe, have this obsession with gangs and gangsters and mobsters and whatnot?
Yeah, I think it's weird too. And but in some ways, I mean, I would put like this obsession with mobsters and organized crime in kind of a bucket of an obsession with what I'd call outlaw culture generally, right? I think that there's a particular kind of culture, right? Outlaw culture that is like, that's rebellious, that kind of operates just beneath the kind of the sort of normal society, that that kind of rejects like the rules and rejects whatever, like the status quo. And it is very much, it is a part of American culture that we celebrate rebels, underdogs, people that buck the system, and you know what I mean, people that like that refuse to play by the rules and like, you know, kind of go their own way. And so I would say that in a weird way, organized crime stories fits into that bucket, right? Even though I agree with you, these people are not good people, and sometimes they're actually like psychopaths, like, you know what I mean, like literally psychopathic people, yet somehow they get celebrated. But I think that this notion, this idea that, I mean, look, the time that the events of this book are, you know, in the 1960s, I mean, America is truly corrupted by organized crime at that period of time. I mean, at all levels, right? I mean, this is part of why Bobby Kennedy waged such a war to, you know, to shut down organized crime, was because it was really a crisis moment for the American government, because organized crime really did control so much, right? They didn't just control the gambling business, they controlled the trucking industry, right? They controlled the ports, they controlled, you know what I mean? Like controlled the construction business. I mean, there was so much of American society that was controlled by criminals that it was really a war between the American government and this kind of like weird quasi, you know, shadow government in a way that was corrupt. So in some ways, I think what people are celebrating sometimes is that this idea that like these regular folks, these, you know, these kind of like working class guys or whatever, some immigrants that came over and were able to like organize something that was more powerful than the American government. There's something romantic about that. But I do think you're right that in telling that story, it gets whitewashed, and that what we whitewash is the very real violence and sociopathic and psychopathic behavior that accompanied a lot of that. Now, some of the characters in my book, you know what I mean, are not necessarily, at least at the point of the time these events happening in the book, they're not necessarily murderous psychopaths, but there is murder and violence and some of that same stuff behind a lot of the decisions and a lot of the things that are moving the wheels too. So I think you're right to be critical of it and to question it and to wonder, but I also think that culturally Americans love these kinds of stories. Even if you don't like a mob story, there is some kind of outlaw culture type story that does appeal to you probably as an American, because we like to fantasize about those types of characters because so few of us are those types of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's kind of the, like you said before, there's this fascination with almost like a fantasy of I'm above the law can't get me, you know, and kind of going your own way.
Yeah, definitely. There's, that's one thing that's the trope of every mob movie and every mob story is that the government are dumb, right? That the FBI or the cops or whoever it is trying to catch the mobsters in all these movies are like dum-dums that are always like a step behind. And the mobsters are always like these clever guys who have it all wired and no one can touch them. And I think that's what people find romantic and really love is that idea, right? I mean, people love the story of like the clever, plucky criminal, right? I mean, every crime story, that's what people love. No one likes the story. You never see a crime story about a guy who just like sticks up a 7-Eleven. You know what I mean? It's always got to be some elaborate plot or scheme or whatever. That's what people want. Like they want to think that somebody outsmarted the government, right? I think that's what's the sort of defining trope of a lot of those more successful mob stories.
Oh yeah, definitely. And just crime stories in general. Catch Me If You Can, Ocean's 11. There's just like all these very, you know, famous stories, and they are, like you just said, it's all about duping the cops and how dumb are they and that kind of thing. Someone asked, Kim asked, is your column The Vig available anywhere?
Oh, Fading the Vig. Well, yeah, it's still up. I think you can still find it online at McSweeney's. The ones that I did anyway are still available. You can find, I think they're linked on my website too, which is davidhillonline.com. Yeah, but I'd love it if people would read those. I was proud of them when I was doing them, and sometimes I miss doing it, because it was kind of a fun kind of thing to write. But yeah, check them out. Maybe one day I'll write a Fading the Vig book or something.
Well, and then I have to read this one because it is Arkansas. And Tracy said, if I had known you were a Longhorn, I probably wouldn't have bought your book.
Yeah, I understand. Look, my father almost disowned me when I went to UT, but like, I was one of the, I went to school there, but by the time I went to Texas, there was no more Texas-Arkansas rivalry. We weren't even in the same conference. I don't think the entire 4 years I was there, I don't think Arkansas and Texas played each other once. So I was able to remain a Razorback fan while going to the University of Texas, which is sort of weird to a lot of old timers who remember those two teams being big rivals. But I'm in the generation that rivalry did not exist anymore.
Yeah. And and then Kathy asked, what did you study at UT?
I studied philosophy, naturally.
The money-making degree.
As if my job choices post college didn't give it away. Yeah, I studied the one thing that had the least job prospects.
And then I had a question for you. So was there like a story or fact or something that you did learn? Because you said your research was pretty extensive and you couldn't include it all in the book. Was there, maybe an anecdote or a fact that you learned that you wish you could have put in the book?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot. And so I'd say this, the thing that I think that I most regret having to cut out of the book was that I had a sort of a section of the book that dove more deeply into the kind of the black underworld and the kind of almost like mirror image of the kind of white gangsters, was that there was a kind of a syndicate of black gangsters around the country who also found Hot Springs to be an important part of their operation as well. And Hot Springs played pretty heavily into that nexus, that dynamic as well. And so there was more in the book at a certain point that kind of got into the African-American community in Hot Springs and also the African-American organized crime syndicate generally in the United States. There was a story that I found fascinating about how, what was happening in Hot Springs and what was happening around the country with the FBI shutting down so many gambling operations around the country, was that white gangsters around the country who got more and more desperate as their operations closed down were kind of taking over black gambling operations, right? And so there was this one guy in the Midwest named Screw Andrews, who was one of these psychopaths we talked about before, who just started murdering black gambling leaders in the Newport, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio area and taking over their business because his business had been shut down by the FBI or the Department of Justice. And so some of these guys came to Hot Springs kind of to hide out from Screw, and he kind of follows them there and kills them in Hot Springs. And so there's kind of some violence in Hot Springs around that. And they found one of the main guys dead in a car right in front of like Dane Harris's house. And so I had told the story originally because I thought it was interesting, the sort of chaos theory of all this about how decisions that were being made in Hot Springs were having these reverberations around the country that were causing all these problems, and how, you know, in other cities there were literally like wars going on because of Hot Springs kind of contributing to what was the sort of the compression of the gambling business around the country, and that violence doesn't matter to people in Hot Springs when it's happening in Ohio, but once it was happening in Hot Springs, it really shocked people. And I don't think people ever fully registered how much it was all connected. You know, I think the police were able to tell themselves, this is just a gang war happening in another city without thinking it had any connection to Hot Springs. But I also found that was a very fascinating kind of story about how there was this complete parallel situation going on within the African-American community to what was happening with, you know, the white folks. And in the end, a lot of that stuff had to come out of the book because the book was whatever, it was 600 pages. And the editor was like, you know, what we could do is just take out everything that's not about one of our three main characters. And so that story, which I was so fond of, ended up out of the book. But maybe one day if there's a TV show, I'll have an opportunity to tell that story.
That almost sounds like a book all of its own, because I know that Hot Springs has a pretty rich history of its Black community.
Yep.
Black Broadway is what they used to call one portion of the town. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Malvern Avenue. And I get into that in the book a bit, and I talk about the sort of the history of the Second Ward and some of the you know, the players on that side of town as well. But I think that you're right. There's probably a whole nother book in telling that story. And I do regret that I wasn't able to tell more of it in The Vapors, for sure.
Well, now you've got your second book.
Yeah. Well, if we sell enough copies of this, there's enough hunger for it. Maybe I can write the sequel. Yeah, get to that.
Well, Dave, do you have any new projects that you're working on that people need to be looking out for?
Yeah, I'm doing a podcast for The Ringer right now called Gamblers. I think it's going to come out start airing next month. So I'm pretty excited about that. So folks should look at that. Look for that next month wherever you get podcasts. That'll be on the Ringer Podcast Network. And yeah, that's what I've been working on most of this year. So check that out.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I don't have any more questions, but this has been really great. We just chewed up an hour real fast. So.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. Yeah. Well, I do appreciate everybody logging on, and definitely appreciate people buying the book and reading it, and keep telling your friends.
Yeah, there are lots of thank yous and lots of enjoyed the books in the comments. So people are interested. I know we have a lot of people on hold for it. We've ordered several copies, so.
Great. Well, if that hold list gets long enough, maybe I'll sell some more books. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Dave, so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's been watching, and y'all have a good night.
Thank you, Corey. Thanks, everybody.